to do, we're going to start a new series called The Time Between the Testaments. And we're going to be focusing on the time between the Testaments. And specifically what I mean by that is the time between the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, which is a period of time of 430 years. And the reason we've been studying Malachi, of course, is because Malachi is basically the last. There's some dispute a little bit. Maybe there might be one book that's a little bit later than that, but for the most part, the agreement is that Malachi is the last book that's written prior to the end of the Old Testament. That it's the last kind of word from God, inspired word from God that we get prior to the beginning of the book of Mark, where we see Jesus and John, or John the Baptist and Jesus coming onto the scene. So Malachi is a good place to look to kind of see where that end comes up at. But what we're going to be looking at in the course of this series is we're going to look through and see the things that happened, the big things that happened between the time that Malachi ends and the time that Jesus appears on the scene, the first century. And I'm going to try not to drag this out for an extended period of time because there's a lot more history in this than there is scripture in this. We're going to see how some of the history impacts the scripture and how some of the scriptures sort of predict the things that happen in history. But the simple fact is we're going to be looking a lot more at history than we are at scripture, and I don't want to spend too much time on that because this is ultimately a Bible study. And while this is, I think, a useful thing to know when it comes to understanding the Bible, I don't want to spend too much time on something that isn't a little bit more directly applicable. Because I know that as much as I enjoy history, not everybody else does. So I don't want to turn this into a semester-long history class that nobody asked for. So with that in mind, we're going to break this down. And what I've tried to do, rather than kind of, it's hard to figure out how best to organize this. But what I've tried to do is to go through and break it down by the major empire that is in power or coming in and out of power during each of these the major periods of time, and there are a total of, let's see, Persian, basically 5 empires that we're going to see. One of them we're going to cover today in this first lesson today and probably next week. And the idea is that we're not going to spend more than a couple of weeks on any of the empires, so that we're not getting bogged down in just an excessive amount of history. The important thing to kind of understand going into this is that most of us have spent quite a bit of our time in our lives reading and studying the Bible. And we think of the Bible as history, and it is. But one of the things that you can kind of get lost in if you don't understand the larger scope of history is you can start to think that the stuff that's happening in the Bible is really all the important stuff that's going on. And from the standpoint of our personal salvation, that's true. But from the standpoint of the larger scope of history, in a lot of cases, Abraham, as important as he is for the lives of the people of the faith and things like that, the things that are going on around Abraham in the larger world are much more important on the global scale than Abraham is, if you take it outside of the religious context. And that's true with a lot of stuff. In fact, it's actually really hard for us to put into a historical context pretty much anything that happened in the Bible prior to about halfway through the books of the Kings. Because almost every other character prior to that, there's no mention of them in history outside of the scriptures. I think actually the very first king that is actually mentioned in any writing or recording that is not from the Bible or from books written, apocryphal books written around the Bible, is actually Jehu. He's the first king that's mentioned, and he's mentioned as giving tribute to a king of, I forget, Assyria, I think it is. So it's not exactly a particularly noble mention that he gets. And so it's once we get past or into that period of time, particularly toward the end of the time of the people when the Israelites are taken into captivity, and then when the people of Judah are taken into captivity, from pretty much that point on, we're able to put almost everything that happens in the Bible into a historical context. It becomes much easier to do that. And certainly the eras that we're going to be looking at, it's very easy to put them into a historical context, mainly because we're going to be working out of history rather than out of the Bible for the most part and putting them in context. But I want us to understand that the reason that I think this is significant is because what we're talking about is, what most of the time we talk about is how does the Bible affect history? And what we're looking at here as much as anything is how does history affect the Bible, or maybe how does God work through history to bring about the things that happen in the Bible? And so these are not irrelevant things. They're not the sort of thing that you absolutely need to know in order to have your salvation work for you. But they are things that are very useful to know in terms of understanding the context in which things happen and the situations that happen from the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because if you think about the situation at Malachi, at the end of Malachi, is very, very different from the situation at the point that John the Baptist appears. You're not even, the king that was the king in power at Malachi's time is probably Artaxerxes of Medo-Persia, and the person who's in charge by the time of Jesus' time is, I forget which emperor it is, Claudius or something like that, of Rome. And if you don't know any sort of history, you kind of think, well, how did that happen? How do we get from one place to the other? And that's what we're going to talk about. So we're going to start, and I call this setting the stage. We're going to talk a little bit about the historical developments that are taking place right at the end of the book of Malachi, leading into what will become the next major empire. So we're going to be starting it by talking about and actually looking at Assyria a little bit. Actually, we're going to jump back. This is a real brief part, though. We're going to talk about Assyria real quickly here. So Assyria is the empire that's in power actually when Israel, northern tribe of Israel, northern country of Israel, is taken into captivity. And this is significant because if you look over in 2 Kings chapter 17, it says that in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hoshea the son of Elah became king over Israel and Samaria and reigned 9 years. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hoshea became his servant and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria found conspiracy in Hoshea, who had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and had offered no tribute to the king of Assyria as he'd done year by year. So the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. A recurring theme that we're going to see throughout this time between the Testaments is the fact that the people of Israel, the Jews, have a really hard time with the notion of paying tribute to anybody or of being under the control of anybody. Why would that be? Why would the Jews, whether it's Assyria or these later empires, they conquered hundreds of different peoples. Why would the Jews, more than perhaps any other group of people, have such a problem with the notion of paying tribute or being subservient to some other nation?
They were supposed to be subservient to God.
Okay. But for the most part, most of these kings weren't asking to worship a different god. So why would it be such a big deal that some other nation is officially in charge of you?
Well, I think it has, a great deal to do with the attitude that they had toward that very thing, that God was their king.
Okay.
And that they were the chosen nation of God. And because of that, they didn't feel that they were subservient to anybody.
Okay. So I think that's the real key, is God is their king, yes, but the really key part is that they see themselves as being the chosen people, the special people, the ones who are supposed to have the blessings of God and that are supposed to be able to, to be the ones who win the battles and who succeed. And so when they're finding themselves losing and they're finding themselves being subject to other nations, they always struggle with that because it basically runs contrary to how they think the world should be, to their worldview in a literal sense. It just doesn't make sense to them. And so we're going to see this all throughout it, and actually that's what ultimately leads to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70 is the same thing. They're not able to follow the Roman rules, and they keep rebelling, and it just keeps happening. So Assyria, it says, then the king of Assyria invaded the whole land and went up to Samaria, which is the capital of Israel, and besieged it for 3 years. And in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and carried Israel away into exile to Assyria, and settled them in Halah and Habor on the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And for the most part, the nation of Israel and the people of Israel ceased to be a cohesive group after that. Now, there are still people who can trace their ancestry to being part of those Israelites who were dispersed, but they can no longer trace their tribal lineage or any of that kind of stuff. That was lost when they were sent into captivity. When we look at Assyria, Assyria was a very, very big empire. By the time that they, well, okay, so their initial empire was this darker green area here. By the time of what happens in when they capture Jerusalem, the empire has been expanding and they end up down in here. And eventually, sometime after they actually capture Jerusalem, they're going to
Samaria.
Samaria, yes, I keep saying that. They're actually going to end up controlling all of this, except you kind of notice in here, there's this little section that's kind of partitioned off because, as Jerry points out correctly, that was the one place they really didn't have control over, was actually Judah itself. Jerusalem was controlled. Now, they conquered quite a bit of Judah, but they were not able to conquer Jerusalem or certain other territories because God was protecting the people of Judah. But ultimately, they end up controlling what was at that time the single largest empire that had existed in the world's history. Okay, now why is this important? Why am I even bringing this up? Well, the thing that I think is really significant out of this is actually what happens when the Israelites get moved out. Because when the Israelites get moved out, there's now sort of a vacuum. And so people start moving in from other places and they start intermarrying with what Israelites are left. And the result is the Samaritans. The Samaritans take their name from Samaria, the capital of Israel, and the Samaritans will come to be a group of people, sort of a mixed ethnic race of people, but they will adopt a lot of the general religious and moral tenets of Judaism with some significant differences that we're not going to explore right now. But that's probably the most significant effect that the Assyrian deportation has on the ultimate situation we find in Jesus' time. Because here again, there's really no mention of Samaritans, except in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. Some of the people that are mentioned are probably Samaritan, but they're not mentioned in that way. There's no mention of Samaritans, but then by Jesus' time, the Samaritans are a big deal. I mean, Jesus tells a whole parable based around the relationship between the Jews and the Samaritans. So this is where that gets started, and we'll talk as we go through these different empires about the things that led to the hatred between the Jews and Samaritans. But initially, at least, they just come in and sort of fill the void. And early on, at least, it's actually a fairly good relationship because King Hezekiah and I want to say Josiah or Joash are able to get the Samaritans to help contribute to some of the work in refurbishing the temple after years of neglect. So the Samaritans, early on at least, are relatively aligned with the Jews. It's not until later on, one empire away, that there starts to be some real friction. So that's kind of the first thing that we see happening. But let's move, we're going to jump forward a little bit to the Babylonian Empire or the Chaldean Empire. Both terms are used pretty much the same.
What year was Samaria taken over by the Syrians?
I want to say 721, because that's what it says in my notes. So I'm going to go with 721. Yeah. That's when they were deported. And here again, that's one of the ones that we can actually put pretty clearly into a historical context, because it gets, the Assyrians were pretty fanatical record keepers. And so actually, it's especially when they're talking about their conquest. They don't want to talk about it so much when they lose, but when they win, they write all sorts of, messages and bragging and everything else. And so we can place it pretty clearly during a period of time there.
I've got to remember, you say 721, we're going backwards.
Yes, we're at 721 BC right now, so we're going to be counting down. By the way, one other thing I'll tell you is I'm recording this class. I'm going to record this class throughout because it's kind of fact heavy, and so unless you really want to take notes, I'll post it so that you guys can go back and watch it later if you want to, or if you want to have somebody else watch it, it'll be available so that way you're not
They want royalties when you sell it to somebody.
Right. Unfortunately, I put all this stuff on YouTube, and it's really easy to download for free from YouTube, so it doesn't work so good. Anyway, okay. So Babylonia comes on the scene next, and the Babylonian Empire eventually basically conquers the Assyrian Empire, plus some extra. We'll see a map in a second here. And the really important king in this regard is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is the one who conquers Jerusalem. And this happens over in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, where you have a king named Jehoiakim. He's 25 years old when he becomes king. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord his God. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up against him and bound him with bronze chains to take him to Jerusalem. or sorry, to take him to Babylon. Okay, so he is actually deported. And this happens in 605 BC. That's when he's deported. It says Nebuchadnezzar also brought some of the articles of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and the abominations which he did, they are written in the book of the kings of Israel and Judah. And Jehoiachin, his son, became king in his place. Now we also see a parallel account of this over in Daniel chapter 1, where it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. He brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. And then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability for serving in the king's court. By the way, bear in mind that Daniel is writing this about himself, which kind of comes across as arrogant if it weren't for the fact that what he's saying is inspired by God. So anyway, he ordered him, Ashpenaz, to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. So what we see happening here is it's not just, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't just take Jehoiakim back, he also takes some of the nobles, people who were of royal blood from Jerusalem, and he takes them back with him. And the idea here is not, this isn't a punishment exactly. It is a deportation of a sort, but it's not intended as a punishment exactly. One of the concepts of diplomacy during this time and all the way through the Middle Ages even was the notion of exchanging or taking family members partly as a ransom, but mainly as a way of teaching them about the culture of the other party, other country, so that they could better appreciate and better interact with that country and perhaps create some sort of relationship, positive relationship between the conquering country or nation and the subservient nation. So that's the idea here of what's going on. So this happens in 605 BC. Here again, if we take a look, the Babylonian and Median empires, the colors up here do not come out really well. The Babylonian one does. Babylon is bigger than Assyria. Not by a lot, but it's somewhat bigger than Assyria. But by the time Babylonia gets pretty big, it's not media like, videos and movies and music. It's the media, the Medes and the Persians. They're already getting big. In fact, they're even bigger than Babylonia is. So Babylon is bigger than Assyria, but by the time that they reach the height of their power, Medo-Persia is also already growing as well. So what we see with Babylonia is that, it goes on from there, Jehoiachin was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 3 months and 10 days in Jerusalem, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord. I want us to stop for a second and contemplate what that suggests. He was 8 years old when he became king. He was only king for 3 months and 10 days. So what does that suggest about the moral culpability of an 8-year-old? No, it suggests something significant about it.
Apparently God has held Jehoiachin accountable.
Yeah. So the suggestion here is that even at 8 years old, that he was accountable for his actions, and whatever the choices he made, they were bad enough to be considered evil in the sight of the Lord, which is kind of a troubling concept to me, quite frankly.
I just have always read that he had to have had some kind of mentors or somebody was really pulling the strings.
Well, we're going to see in a second here was pulling the strings. It wasn't even somebody in Jerusalem. He was being, the strings were being pulled by Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
But the reality is that God is accounting to him, at least the way this is written, is accounting to him. Now the Chronicle Writer, it's kind of interesting because the Chronicle Writer never has like a neutral view on somebody. You either did evil in the sight of the Lord or you did good in the sight of the Lord. So it could simply be that the Chronicle Writer is basically defaulting to evil in the sight of the Lord because what the things that went on during the time period, the short time that he was king, were evil. And so it may be more of an indictment of the nation of Israel at that time than Jehoiachin himself. But I just think it's interesting that it specifically calls him out as doing evil in the sight of the Lord. So it says, at the turn of the year, Nebuchadnezzar sent and brought him to Babylon with the valuable articles of the house of the Lord, and he made his kinsman Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. Elsewhere in the scriptures, I want to say it's in Jeremiah, it actually calls out, or maybe it's in Kings, it actually calls out that Nebuchadnezzar set Jehoiachin up as king. And you can see the logic to some extent. You set an 8-year-old up as king because an 8-year-old is not really going to tend to argue with you very much. But it appears that, I think, and this maybe ties into what you're saying, Jerry, it appears that the people who were guiding Jehoiachin were not giving him very good advice because he was not doing what Nebuchadnezzar wanted. So Nebuchadnezzar brings him to Babylon along with valuable articles of the house of the Lord, and he makes his kinsman Zedekiah king over Judah and Jerusalem. So this is actually another deportation where some more people are taken away from Judah and Jerusalem. It says Zedekiah was 21 years old when he became king, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. He did not humble himself before Jeremiah, the prophet who spoke for the Lord. He also rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, who had made him swear allegiance by God. Yes, sir?
Just to point out, to be sure that we know who Zedekiah was, he is still in the lineage of David.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that was important in
yes.
when I was reading.
All of the kings that are listed in the kings of Judah are in the lineage of David.
He was an uncle, I think, wasn't he?
I forget, something like that. Yeah, I think he was the uncle of Jehoiakim. Yes, I think you're right about that. So, but he rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar, even though he swore allegiance by God, which, by the way, probably kind of irritated God beyond whatever else he was doing, because when you swear by God's name, even if you don't like what you're swearing to, he kind of holds you accountable for that. He expects you to actually do it. So the Lord sent word to them again and again by his messengers, talking about the people of Israel, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place, but they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, that's Babylonia, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. All the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the king and his officers, he brought them all to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. So, let's see, so those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon. They were servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. What does Sabbath mean?
Rest.
Rest. So what it's basically saying is that the land enjoyed a period of rest. What does that mean by that? That the land of, what had been the land of Canaan and what was the land of Israel, that it enjoyed a period of rest?
The people that were left on both occasions when they came to Jerusalem and took prisoners back were the poor and the uneducated and had probably no knowledge of how to take care of the land or how to even grow anything. Okay. And so the land sat for 70 years in a native state. Fallow. Yes. That's a better word. But that would have been, to me, I think that's what it's talking about.
I think it's talking about that mainly, but I also think it's talking about spiritually speaking. Because for 70 years, there were no Israelites in the land to do evil things. Now, that didn't mean they weren't doing evil things in Babylon or wherever else, but it was kind of like the sinfulness that was at the core and the rottenness of the kingdoms was taken away.
I think there's some reference in Jeremiah that even those people that were left were not very faithful to God.
That's true. And, well, it becomes less true once they go to Egypt and get killed, and then there's not any of them left. But so in any event, though, there's this period of time where the land is just kind of fallow, and where the Israelites and the Jews and the people of Judah have all been removed, except perhaps some small remnant. But it's pretty much empty of the Israelites for that period of time. Okay, so that destruction of Jerusalem, they tore down the walls, they burned the gates, they tore down the temple, they destroyed everything. During that period of time, that is the third deportation. That's the biggest one. It takes place in 587 and 586 BC. They deport the overwhelming majority of the Jews get deported during that period of time. But there are some that are left. And so the people who Nebuchadnezzar had left in the land of Judah, he appointed Gedaliah over there. Gedaliah was probably distant royal blood of some sort. And Gedaliah said to them, "Do not be afraid of the servants of the Chaldeans. Live in the land and serve the king of Babylon, and it will be well with you." And I should mention right now, for the purposes, I a lot of times in my sermons will pull out a sentence here and there that doesn't really directly apply to what we're talking about, as long as it doesn't change the meaning of a passage for the sake of time. I'm doing that even more so here, because if I went through and left in all the little commentaries and religious, here's what the Chronicle author thinks about what this guy did or whatever, this would take forever to read through all of this. So I've taken significant elements out of this. But again, what I'm focusing on is the historical aspects of this, and nothing I've taken out affects the clarity of what's going on here, or the truth that underlies it. Okay, so I just want you to know that. So if you're following along with this, or if you watch it at home and you try to find it in your Bible, you'll find these here, but you will find that the passages have been edited to make it more simple. So he says, "Don't be afraid of the servants of the Chaldeans. Live in the land, serve the king of Babylon, and it will be well with you." But it came about in the 7th month that Ishmael of the royal family came with 10 men and struck Gedaliah down, so that he died along with the Jews and the Chaldeans who were with him at Mizpah. So this guy shows up and kills basically all of the collaborators and also the Chaldeans that were there. So then all the people, both small and great, arose and went to Egypt, for they were afraid of the Chaldeans. And at the time they thought Egypt was a safe place to go, because Egypt had defeated the Babylonians in battle just a few years before that. But it's not going to be a very safe place to be for very long. And so ultimately the people that go there, and Jeremiah tries to get them not to go, because he says God will restore you, and he's got to restore the people back to the land if you just wait and be patient. It's going to be okay. But they won't listen to him, and in fact they drag him down to Egypt with them, and the vast majority of them are killed in Egypt, either by Egyptian forces or Babylonian forces. But whatever's left of that group of people ends up getting deported as a retaliatory measure in about 582 to 581 BC. So when we look at the Babylonian deportations, the first one is in 605 BC. That's when Jehoiakim and the nobles like Daniel go. Second one is in 597 when Jehoiachin and the other nobles go. The third one is in 587 at the destruction of Jerusalem. And the fourth one is retribution for the assassination of Gedaliah. So there's these 4 different deportations, but by the time they're done, there are almost no Jews left in the land. They're pretty much completely gone. Okay, so that's where the period of captivity, the 70 years of captivity, takes place. And during that 70 years of captivity is when Medo-Persia, or the Achaemenid, I cannot say this one. Anyway, the Achaemenid Empire arises, or becomes more powerful. I showed you on the map of Babylon earlier that Medo-Persia was already on the rise even when Babylon was at its height, and they continue to rise and continue to rise. So what happens in Daniel chapter 5 is the Belshazzar, who Daniel refers to as the king, he's actually the king's son, who is in line to inherit the throne. He's the son of Nabonidus, who was the 4th king after Nebuchadnezzar. So they go through 4 kings pretty rapidly. The Nebuchadnezzar lasts for a long time, but then his son only lasts for a year or less, and so does his son, and so does his son, and finally Nabonidus takes over, and his son Belshazzar is holding this big party, and this hand appears out of nowhere and writes in letters of fire on the wall this inscription, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And so the king tries to get people to interpret it. Nobody can, so he calls in Daniel, because Daniel's good at interpreting weird stuff. And Daniel interprets it for him. He says the inscription that was written says this, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. So it says that, basically it's saying that twice, numbered and ended, numbered and ended. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. And then finally Peres, which sounds weird because the word was Upharsin, but Peres is the singular of Upharsin, which is the plural. Peres, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. So basically, Belshazzar is told by Daniel, you're going to lose the kingdom. And he was really talking about his father Nabonidus, but they're going to lose the kingdom. And sure enough, that same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Darius the Mede is a problem because there is no history that talks about a guy named Darius the Mede outside of this reference in Daniel. Nowhere in history is there anything. There is a Darius. There are two Dariuses, but one of them is way too early and the other one is way too late. So Darius, there are two or three views that are promulgated most commonly about this. One is that they're actually referring to a guy named Gubaru, who is Cyrus, the governor, that the actual king of Medo-Persia, who is Cyrus, is going to put in charge of Babylon. That could be an explanation, although his name is never referred to as being Darius, so that's problematic. The second one is that for some reason Daniel is referring to Cyrus the Great as Darius the Mede, because there's going to be a Darius the Great later on, and in fact, probably during Daniel's lifetime, there's going to be Darius the Great, and so perhaps that's what's going on there, although, that would be an odd mistake to make. The third possibility is that what Daniel is basically saying, because if you read the book of Daniel, he spends a lot of time in sort of this twilight world between reality and the dreams that he's being given, the visions that he's being given. So it's possible that what he's really saying here is that Darius the Mede, the Darius is going to become Darius the Great, who's not even maybe born yet, but that kingdom is going to become his kingdom, and ultimately Darius is going to become the greatest king of it. So it could be that what he's saying is that Darius the Mede, the descendant of Cyrus, is going to receive the kingdom because Cyrus is taking it now. Those are three possibilities. None of them are entirely satisfactory, but the simple reality is that the history of this period of time is pretty clear, and there is no Darius the Mede during the period of time when there's a transition from Babylonia to Medo-Persia. There's just no getting around that. So we have to figure out what Daniel might have meant by that. These are our best guesses, but nevertheless, the timing of this we know because we actually know that Darius the Mede conquers Israel in 560 BC. So basically about 21 years, about 21 years after the initial deportation of the Jews takes place is when Darius the Mede conquers, about 70 years actually, because it's going to become significant. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. Okay, so what's interesting is that Jeremiah has predicted this. Jeremiah in chapter 25, he says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, and I will send to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. I will bring them against this land and against its inhabitants and against all these nations round about. And I will utterly destroy them and make them a horror and a hissing and an everlasting desolation. This whole land will be a desolation and a horror, and these kings will serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then it will be when 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon, and that nation declares the Lord for their iniquity, and the land of the Chaldeans, and I will make it an everlasting desolation." So he says, they get 70 years from the point that they conquer you and take you into captivity. 70 years, and then after that it's going to be over for Babylon, and that's of course exactly what happens. So when we look at the Neo-Persian Empire, it's not surprising that it's huge because Neo-Persia already controlled this area before they captured Babylon, but they also moved all the way over into, this would be Turkey, and into the edge of Greece, and they also were able to conquer all of Egypt eventually. So at the point that they conquered Jerusalem, they haven't yet conquered Egypt. Egypt and this area are the last of their conquests. But in conquering Babylon, and basically it's almost a bloodless coup, there's a series of battles that take place far removed from Babylonia itself. But ultimately the Medes just sort of march into Babylon and take over without a shot, or without an arrow being fired, I guess. No shots exactly. But anyway, so they end up conquering, and again, this becomes the single largest empire in the history of the world up until this point. And so they take over all this different stuff. Now what's cool is that Cyrus, so Cyrus conquers, and in 539, when he actually takes control of Babylon, so the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that's not actually his first year on the throne. He actually takes the throne in 560, but it's the first year that he's in charge of Babylon and where the Israelites are. In the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, and this is Cyrus the First, he's also called Cyrus the Great, And in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout his kingdom and also put it in writing, saying, "Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." So Cyrus issues a proclamation, and it's not even just so much that you can go, it's basically you need to go. You know, God wants me to do this. And it's interesting because Cyrus had some encounters with Daniel very early on in his reign. And it could very well be that one of his early encounters with Daniel is what gave him this insight that he needed to do this. Because he makes specific reference to the Lord. And in that context, you notice that word that's there, that small caps word, that's because it's a reference to Yahweh. And Cyrus, the king of Persia, would not know the name of Yahweh unless he learned it from a Jew or got it in a vision, one of the two. So he says, you can go home, basically. That's what he tells them. So in Jeremiah, and what's interesting is that this is predicted. It's, you notice it said that to fulfill the word of the prophet in Jeremiah. Well, it's not just the prophecy of Jeremiah about the 70 years. Jeremiah also has lots of prophecies about letting the people return. So in Jeremiah 46, there's a prophecy that says, "I shall give them over to the power of those who are seeking their lives, even into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and into the hand of his officers. Afterward, however, it will be inhabited as the days of old, declares the Lord. But as for you, O Jacob, my servant, do not fear nor be dismayed, O Israel. For see, I am going to save you from afar, and your descendants from the land of their captivity. And Jacob will return and be undisturbed and secure, with no one making him trouble." Now, the temptation is to say, well, he must be talking to the northern tribes of Israel because they were the ones that were called Israel. The other tribe was called Judah. But the term Israel and Jacob are used basically interchangeably to speak about the Israelites people, whether it's the northern tribes or the people of Judah. And in this context, it's almost certainly talking to the Jews because the Israelites, the northern tribes of Israel, wouldn't have even been around to hear this prophecy. Whereas when Jeremiah is speaking this, he's speaking to the people of Judah. Okay, yes.
Except that when they did come back in, there were Israelites that came
That's
from
true.
many other areas and many other nations back to Jerusalem.
Right.
Because they didn't have their genealogy correctly.
Because by the time that Cyrus was done conquering, he had conquered all the places that the Jews had been deported to.
Yeah.
And so when he said they could go back, then yeah, they did. And so it wasn't just, now it was only the Jews that were deported from the southern tribes that really probably could still trace their genealogy clearly to the specific tribes. But there were certainly many who knew they were Jews, they just didn't know exactly what tribe they were from necessarily. And even then, they might have been able to some extent. It's really not until the dispersion under the Romans that the lineage is completely lost because of the degree to which the records were destroyed and the generations that followed that could not keep track of those things anymore. So, okay, so the prophecy of Jeremiah, this is about 70 years or so before the return of the Jews. So that's kind of impressive. What's even more impressive is the prophecy of Isaiah, which was probably done in more like 700 or so, no, actually further back than that, 740 BC. So something like 200 and, no, more than that. Something like 200 years before this, Isaiah prophesies, and he says, "It is I who says of Cyrus," a name that does not appear in history at this point in time. "It is I who says of Cyrus, he is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desires, and he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple, your foundation will be laid." So Isaiah prophesied long before Cyrus was ever born that he was going to come and that he was going to be the shepherd, that he was going to help to restore Jerusalem and restore the temple.
And his name would be Cyrus.
The guy's name is going to be Cyrus. And so it's fascinating that this happens. And this is not just, it isn't just like the Bible calls this guy Cyrus. History knows of this guy, Cyrus the Great. He's a very famous and very important person in history. And so this is a prophecy fulfilled, and it's a prophecy that was written well before the actual event took place. And what's interesting also is that, I didn't go on to write this, but at the end of Isaiah 44 and over in Isaiah 45, it describes Cyrus. And it describes him in terms, he's the only in the Old Testament, the only person who's not descendant of Abraham, from the point of Abraham on, who's described in completely positive terms. Almost every, so if you look in the scriptures from the point of Abraham on, the descendants of Abraham are sometimes and often described in positive terms, and sometimes in nothing but positive terms. But nobody else is. No kings of Assyria or people elsewhere, none of them are described in positive terms. Cyrus is the one exception to this, where Isaiah has nothing but good things to say about it, because he's going to be the one that restores the Israelites. And also it appears that he's obedient to God. There's nothing in what we see in the story of Daniel and then of the restoration of the Jews that would suggest that Cyrus is disobedient to God. And the one thing Cyrus was vulnerable to was manipulation. And so in the book of Daniel, there's a couple of different occasions where his officials manipulate him into doing things that are bad for Daniel and the Jews, but as soon as he realizes what's going on, he undoes it. So Cyrus, it seems like, is a genuinely good guy. Okay, we're going to stop right there because we're at the end of we're a little past 10:15. We will pick up with Ezra and Nehemiah and the return and all that stuff next week, and we should be able to finish out this section by the end of next week. So hopefully we've got a 2-week cycle.
I got a
Yes,
quick
sir.
question about
Sure.
Jerusalem. Is it because, it was, I guess, the Jews consider it like a holy place,
Yeah.
holy
Oh, I
city?
can see it close.
It keeps getting destroyed and then people keep going back.
Right.
Why didn't they go to some other place
So,
and build a temple there? You know what I mean?
Right.
What was so important about
So-
that place? Because I
Okay.
know it was higher and all that, but still, I would.
I'm going to write your question out. We're going to talk about it next week.
Okay.
That's a good question, but it's a bigger question that I can answer
Okay.
without going way over time. So you try to remember, but I'm going to write it down.
All right.
And basically what I'm going to do is, why did they keep going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple?
City of David.
And it has, in short, just real quick, it has to do, number one, with the significance of this area to movement. If you notice, real quick here, if you notice no, not right now. If you notice those maps, every one of those maps has a major empire. Part of that empire is that area, down there through the Levant. The Levant is what it's called, through Israel, through Judah. Because it is the main way to get from Asia Minor, not Asia, China and stuff, but from Asia and a lot of those nations in what are now Saudi Arabia, places like that, to get from there down towards Egypt and Africa. It's the primary way to do that. So it's hugely important as a commerce thing. It's on the Mediterranean, so it's got access to the sea and everything else like that. So on the one hand, you have the practical, and on the other side of it is what Jerry said very quietly, which is it's the city of David. And for the Jews, there's significance in that because of the association of the kingdom with David and of Jerusalem with the temple of David and Solomon. And so, you could ask that question more broadly today. Why are the Jews so determined that the only place they could rebuild the temple is on the Temple Mount, when the original concept of the place of worship wasn't even a building, it was a tent, But they're obsessed with that, or at least the hardcore Orthodox Jews that live in Jerusalem are obsessed with rebuilding the temple on the Temple Mount. And it's a weird thing because it suggests a rigidity of thinking that is ironically the opposite of what the tabernacle was designed to meet. The tabernacle was designed to be flexible. So it's a weird thing. We'll talk more about that next week because it is a very interesting question.